Hello, and welcome to another overanalyzation video with me. Considering the latter part of the previous video, where I talked about demography and all of this, I thought about it for a few hours and did a little bit of research, air quotes, a little bit, maybe, about that very subject, and especially in Asia and Europe, because that's kind of where it is happening. Since those are pretty well-developed areas of the world. And by Asia, I mean Southeast Asia specifically, so China, Japan, South Korea, Hong Kong, those countries / autonomous regions of Asia have, in the past 70 years, industrialized, went from agrarian, very poor countries to extremely, industrialized countries that export loads of goods and services, especially in the technology sector, which was especially the case for Japan and South Korea a few decades ago. But however, now that the demography is basically collapsing, the working age population is less stronger than it was, say, 30 years ago, 50 years ago. They've kind of, declined in that sector, and other countries have overtaken them, basically, in terms of exports, that being China in the 1990s, when they liberalized and opened up their economy to the world, and started creating mass consumer products at a massive scale in factories and this. Sure, at that point not being the headquarters of many multinational spanning companies such as Samsung, Toyota, Mitsubishi, etc. They eventually in the 1990s surpassed the economies of South Korea and Japan, and kind of became de facto world leaders in terms of technology production and innovation, maybe a little bit, since at that point the demographic collapse had already started in Japan and Korea, which hit Japan especially hard in the 1990s. So whilst Japan was kind of declining in that aspect, China was basically getting really rich. Also, now that I'm mentioning the industrialized phase, let's have a look at their histories post World War II and at Europe and North America as well, subsequently, because those two continents, regions, played a fairly significant role, especially for Japan after that point. So after World War II, Japan was obviously defeated and nuked and completely destroyed and economically, and was subsequently occupied by the United States. So was the Korean Peninsula, half of it anyway, and obviously the northern part by the Soviets. Europe was very much in that curious position, given the bombing, the Allies inflicted, the continental bit anyway. Focusing on Europe, Europe obviously received lots of money from the Marshall Plan, and soon enough mechanized and started re-industrializing in a sort of way, thanks to the funding from the United States. And also the United States set up trade tariffs after the Bretton Woods conference, especially into Germany. Back in Asia, obviously they invested a lot into Japan, rebuilding its infrastructure, certainly way more than South Korea. South Korea was more or less just a military post out in Asia, given its, again, curious position right next to North Korea, which is occupied by the Soviets. The Japanese got right into reindustrialization, started focusing mostly on exporting goods and services, mostly manufacturing vehicles, indoor devices, radios, and televisions, etc. And by 1952, they were at the same kind of industrial rate as they were pre-war, which is very impressive. In that aspect, they surpassed Germany, which at that point had been a starving country. Rationing was very common. It took a little bit longer for them to recover, though that recovery was sped up by the funding from the French and the Americans as well. So soon enough, Japan's population basically exploded, as seems to be a fairly common trend when it comes to very quick industrialization when we look back at history. Germany's population started to grow rapidly as well, though at a slower rate than most European countries around it, and especially Japan. So that was the baby boom of the 1950s, 1960s, where loads of baby boomers were born, and those numbers were never really fully reflected in the superseding Gen X generation. With the public availability of the pill and contraception as a whole. South Korea, meanwhile, was extremely impoverished and basically ravaged by famine after the Korean War. Then basically when the Second Korean Republic was set up, which I think only lasted for a year, they introduced various regulations of the economy, and basically he introduced this kind of nationalistic, capitalist, statewide program, which emphasized work and focus on industrialization, lowering infant mortality, etc., etc. And much like Japan, the economy obviously increased when they started exporting various goods, and these corporations and firms became very important in the country and abroad as well, subsequently because of the economy, which grew a lot. Don't know if I mentioned that, but yeah. With China, which was under the Maoist regime, killed a lot of its own people, and wasn't doing particularly well the first few decades after both the Civil War with the Kuomintang army and the Second World War with Japan. So it was very much a agricultural state for that point. But eventually after the Sino-Soviet split and Nixon coming and kind of opening up relations in this, it kind of opened up a little bit to the world. Did a little bit of industrialization. That was really in the 1990s, and when they did those, when they changed the regulations of the economy, and basically became a hyper-capitalistic society. And as mentioned earlier in the video, it started exporting cheap manufactured goods and this, and obviously the economy grew, because when you've got a large part of your population which is involved in the industrial sector, technology sector, I guess, it's really good for the economy, because you're making money exporting stuff. Also, when literally hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of poverty in the 20th century, when China and Japan and Korea improved, the culture subsequently changed as well, and so did the attitude towards education. And loads of people were incentivized to get a degree, go to university, and all of a sudden people's careers were basically the most important part of their lives. It was kind of like a measuring tool when it came to the hierarchy, one's position in daily life, basically. Also, China introduced the one-child policy. You might have heard of it in I think 1918. Because there's just so many people being born, they literally just couldn't feed their population, and that was obviously lifted, I think, in 2016. But by that time, the damage was already made, and so now China's got the biggest population of people, of elderly people over the age of 60. I think around 400 million, right? Which is a number like nobody can really imagine, right? It's just so big, and reportedly the population is already decreasing. So you've got basically 2 or 3 generations whose natural cycle of reproduction was heavily moderated, and then obviously you've got the low fertility rates which came with that. When it comes to Germany, Japan, and South Korea, they were already doing very well way before China, already in the 1970s. And obviously, as the trend goes, the more richer the family is, the less, the incentive to have, many kids. Plus the wide availability of the pill and healthcare as well, which just happens to be really good in those countries. So yeah, that was my answer to why countries in Southeast Asia and Europe are going through a demographic collapse. Well, especially Germany, when it comes to Europe. Though it was kind of long-winded, I still got a lot to say about the future of demography, not just in Asia and Europe, but also in Africa and the Americas, which could be maybe interesting. So that will be in part 2, which will probably come out tomorrow. So stay tuned for that. Yeah.